Three Italian mob soldiers stood in the D-block corridor of Sing Sing prison on March 11, 1945, at precisely 2:17 p.m. Tony the Blade Marquez, Vincent Callo, and Sal Romano weren't random criminals looking to make a name for themselves. These were professional killers, each with a specific role in what they believed would be the perfect prison assassination. Tony was the leader, a 34-year-old made man in the Luciano family serving 15 years for armed robbery. Inside Sing Sing, Tony was prison royalty, protected, feared, and untouchable. He'd already killed 2 men behind bars, and both deaths had been ruled self-defense because the Italian mob owned enough guards to ensure Tony's version of events was always believed. Vincent Callo was the muscle. Standing 6 feet 3 inches and weighing 240 pounds of former boxer brutality. He was doing 20 years for manslaughter, and in his 3 years inside Sing Sing, he'd put 7 men in the prison infirmary. Nobody crossed Vincent. Nobody even looked at him wrong. Sal Romano completed the trio as the quiet, reliable operator serving 12 years for extortion. He worked in the prison laundry, kept his head down, followed orders without question. And when Tony and Vincent needed a third man they could trust completely, Sal was the obvious choice. The timing was calculated with surgical precision. Bumpy Johnson was walking from the library back to his cell at 2:15 p.m., right during shift change when the corridor was full of inmates but empty of guards. Tony stepped out first, blocking Bumpy's path. Vincent and Sal flanked him immediately, forming a wall of Italian mob power. 60 inmates watched from their cells, but nobody moved. Nobody shouted, nobody intervened. This was prison justice, mob style, and everyone understood that interfering meant becoming the next target. Tony pulled out his shiv, a weapon he'd sharpened for weeks in the machine shop specifically for this moment. "You know why we're here," he said, his voice calm and confident. Bumpy's response was quiet but defiant. Luciano's scared of a man in a cage. Tony's smile was cold. "Luciano's smart. You're a problem, so we're solving it." They didn't give Bumpy any chance to fight back, to negotiate, or even to defend himself. This was an execution, pure and simple. Vincent grabbed Bumpy from behind, his massive arms locking around Bump. Wise body, immobilizing him completely. Sal came from the side, blocking any escape route. Tony moved in for the kill with methodical brutality. The first stab went into Bumpy's abdomen, the blade sliding between ribs with practiced ease. The second stab hit his chest, targeting the heart. The third stab came from behind, between the ribs, angling toward vital organs. Bumpy went down to his knees, blood already soaking through his prison uniform. But they weren't done. The fourth stab hit his shoulder. The fifth pierced his side. The sixth was another back wound, deepening the damage to his internal organs. Bumpy collapsed forward onto the concrete floor, his blood spreading across the ground like spilled paint. Tony leaned down, positioned the blade one final time, and delivered the seventh. Stabbed directly into Bumpy's back, angled specifically toward the lung. He whispered in Bumpy's ear, "Luciano sends his regards. Harlem's ours now." Bumpy's eyes were still open, still conscious. His lips moved, trying to form words, but only blood came out. He coughed, a horrible, wet, gurgling sound that made even hardened criminals turn away in discomfort. Tony stood up, laughed, and casually ped his bloody shiv on his prison pants. "He's done," he said to Vincent and Sal. "Let's go." The 3 Italians walked away calmly, confidently, their heads high. They had just killed Harlem's king in front of 60 witnesses, and they weren't running, they weren't hiding, they were proud. Guards finally arrived, their whistles blowing frantically as they rushed toward the scene. One guard checked Bumpy's pulse, his hands shaking as he felt for signs of life. "He's still breathing," the guard shouted. "Get the doctor now!" They carried Bumpy to the infirmary on a stretcher, his blood leaving a continuous trail down the corridor like breadcrumbs marking the path to death. The prison doctor examined Bumpy's wounds and his face went pale. 7 stab wounds, 2 to vital organs, a punctured lung. Massive blood loss, at least 3 pints already gone. The doctor looked at the warden and shook his head grimly. "I'll try," he said, "but he's got maybe 6 hours to live. 8 if he's incredibly lucky." That night, Tony, Vincent, and Sal celebrated in their cells. They passed around contraband whiskey, laughed about how easy it had been to take down the legendary Bumpy Johnson. 7 stabs, surgical precision, perfect execution. They were untouchable, protected by Italian mob power that reached from the streets of New York right into the guard towers of Sing Sing prison. They had no idea they just made the worst mistake of their lives. They had 72 hours left before they would understand their fatal error, because Bumpy Johnson didn't die that night. He didn't die the next day. And three men who tried to kill him were about to discover that failing to finish the job completely would cost them everything: their bodies, their freedom, and in one case, their very consciousness. They were about to wish they had turned those shivs on themselves instead. The Italian mobsters who stabbed Bumpy Johnson 7 times that afternoon in Sing Sing prison operated under a fundamental misunderstanding of how power actually worked behind those concrete walls. Tony the Blade Marquez, Vincent Callo, and Sal Romano relied on traditional mob infrastructure, corrupted guards who could be bought, institutional connections that reached from the streets of New York into the prison administration, and the raw physical intimidation that came from being made men in the Luciano family. Believed power flowed from fear, from muscle, from the ability to make official reports disappear and to have murders ruled self-defense. They thought they controlled Sing Sing because they controlled the visible levers of power. They were catastrophically wrong. What they failed to recognize, what they couldn't even conceive of in their worldview, was that Bumpy Johnson had spent the previous 18 months building an entirely different kind of power structure. While the Italian mob focused on corrupting guards and intimidating other inmates, Bumpy had quietly, systematically cultivated relationships with the people everyone else ignored completely. The black porters who pushed carts through the corridors, the kitchen workers who prepared every meal, the laundry staff who handled every piece of clothing, the janitors who cleaned every cell, every common area, every inch of the prison. These were the invisible people, the ones who moved through Sing Sing like ghosts, present everywhere but noticed nowhere. The Italian mobsters looked right through them as if they didn't exist. Bumpy Johnson saw them as human beings. For a year and a half, Bumpy had treated these workers with basic dignity, thank you, and respect in an environment where such treatment was extraordinarily rare. He learned their names. He asked about their families. He shared cigarettes, small favors, words of encouragement. He didn't treat them as servants or tools. He treated them as people with value, with intelligence, with agency. This wasn't charity or manipulation in the traditional sense. Bumpy understood something fundamental about prison dynamics that the Italians in their arrogance had completely missed. The people who clean the floors see everything. The people who deliver the food have access everywhere. The people who handle the laundry know every inmate's routine. The people everyone ignores are actually the ones who know the most, see the most, and have access to places and information that even corrupt Ted guards can't provide. Every small kindness Bumpy showed was an investment. Every moment of respect was a deposit in a bank of loyalty that would pay dividends when he needed them most. And on March 11, 1945, lying in a hospital bed with 7 stab wounds, a punctured lung, gray skin, and labored breathing that the prison doctor said would stop within hours, Bumpy Johnson called in those dead. At hour 36, a day and a half after the attack, when Bumpy should have been dead or at least unconscious and fading, he was conscious enough to whisper instructions. A porter named James visited Bumpy's hospital bed. The conversation was brief. Bumpy's voice was barely audible, each word clearly causing him pain as his damaged lung struggled to function. But James leaned in close, listened careful, nodded once, and left. No guards noticed. No Italian mobsters were watching. James was just another invisible black porter, making his rounds through the hospital wing, exactly as he did every day. What happened next demonstrated the true scope of Bumpy's invisible network. These weren't random acts of revenge carried out by loyal followers. These were coordinated operations that required detail-led knowledge of prison routines, access to specific locations, and the ability to manipulate the physical environment without detection. The porters knew which stairs Vincent Callo walked down every single day at the same time. The janitors had access to industrial cleaning supplies, including grease that could be spread invisibly across metal steps. The kitchen workers understood timing, knew exactly when guards would be distracted during meal preparations. The laundry staff could move through cell blocks without suspicion, could deliver messages, could coordinate actions across different areas of the prison. This network operated completely outside the traditional power structures that the Italian mob controlled. Corrupted guards were useless against it because the guards didn't even ken how it existed. Made men and muscle meant nothing because this wasn't about direct confrontation. It was about manipulation of environment, timing, and circumstance. The Italians had spent years building vertical power, top-down control through intimidation and corruption. Bumpy had built horizontal power, a web of connections among people whose society had rendered invisible, who moved through the unnoticed, and unimpeded, precisely because everyone in authority had trained themselves not to see these workers as significant. From his hospital bed, barely able to breathe, looking like a man at death's door, Bumpy orchestrated a series of accidents that would destroy his attackers completely. He did it through whispered conversations with porters, through silent nods to kitchen workers, to rough the loyalty he'd earned from people the Italian mob had never bothered to acknowledge as human. The greatest irony was that Tony, Vincent, and Sal never even knew this network existed. They celebrated their successful hit, confident in their protection, never realizing that the real power in Sing Sing prison wasn't held by the men with shivs and mob connections. It was held by the invisible army of workers who Bumpy Johnson had treated with simple human respect. When Bumpy called in those debts, that army moved with silent, devastating efficiency. And the Italian mobsters, blinded by their own arrogance and their fundamental misunderstanding of where true power resided, never saw it coming until it was far too late. Vincent Callo was a mountain of a man, standing 6 feet 3 inches tall and waggy. 240 pounds of solid muscle built during his years as a professional boxer before his life of crime landed him in Sing Sing prison. In his 3 years behind bars, he had become a legend of violence and intimidation. 7 men had felt the crushing power of his fists and ended up in the prison infirmary with broken bones, shattered jaws, and internal injuries. Nobody challenged Vincent. Nobody even made eye contact with him if they could avoid it. His physical presence was a weapon in itself, and he knew it. He moved through Sing Sing with the absolute confidence of a man who understood that his size and strength made him virtually untouchable. When Tony the Blade Marquez needed muscle to help assassinate Bumpy Johnson, Vincent was the obvious choice, not just for his loyalty to the Italian mob, but because his sheer physical power made him the perfect person to immobilize a target while the killing blows were delivered. On that afternoon of March 11, 1945, Vincent had grabbed Bumpy Johnson from behind with those massive arms, holding him completely still, while Tony and Sal went to work with their sharpened shivs. Vincent's role was simple, but crucial. Prevent any resistance, escape, any chance for Bumpy to fight back. He'd executed his part of the assassination perfectly. When they walked away from Bumpy's bleeding body lying on the corridor floor, Vincent felt nothing but satisfaction and confidence. 7 stab wounds, including a punctured lung. The prison doctor said Bumpy had maybe 6 hours to live. Vincent and his partners celebrated that night with contraband whiskey, laughing about how easy it had been. Vincent wasn't worried about retaliation because, in his mind, dead men don't take revenge. And Bumpy Johnson was as good as dead. Vincent maintained his routine in the days after the attack. He heard that Bumpy was still alive somehow, still breathing against all odds, but Vincent wasn't concerned. 7 stab wounds don't just heal. A punctured lung doesn't just repair itself. Bumpy might be clinging to life in the hospital wing, but he wasn't a threat. He was a dying man, waiting for the inevitable. Vincent continued moving through the prison with his usual arrogant confidence, following the same patterns he'd followed for 3 years. Every day he walked down the same metal staircase from the 3rd tier of his cell block, descending 20 steel steps to reach the ground level. He'd walked down those stairs 1,000 times before, maybe more. He knew every step, every railing, every sound the metal made under his weight. It was muscle memory, routine, automatic. But on this particular day, something was different. As Vincent reached the middle of the staircase, his right foot came down on the metal step, and instead of gripping, industrial grease had been spread across 3 consecutive steps, not thick enough to be obvious, not visible unless you were specifically looking for it, but more than enough to eliminate any traction. Vincent's foot shot out from under him. His massive 240-pound frame suddenly had nothing to grip, nothing to stabilize against. For a man who'd made his living with his body, who'd trained for years as a boxer to maintain perfect balance and control, the sensation must have been terrifying and utterly foreign. His arms flailed, reaching desperately for the railing, but his momentum was already carrying him forward and down. Vincent's body tumbled down those 20 metal stairs with devastating force. Each step was an edge of unforgiving steel, and his back, his head, his spine slammed against each one in succession. The sound echoed through the entire cell block, a horrible rhythmic series of impacts that made inmates freeze in their cells, that made guards look up from their posts in alarm. Thud, 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 thud. The percussion of flesh and bone meeting metal, over and over, each impact worse than the last because his falling body was gathering speed and force with every step. His head bounced off steel edges. his spine twisted and compressed with each collision. The vertebrae in his back absorbed impacts they were never designed to withstand. Then Vincent reached the bottom of the stairs, and there was silence. A terrible, expectant silence, as everyone waited to see if he would get up, if that massive, powerful body would rise as it always had before. And then the scream. Ming started. Vincent's voice, usually so deep and commanding, now rose in a pitch of pure agony and terror. "I can't feel my legs! I can't feel my legs!" He kept screaming it over and over, his hands reaching down to touch his legs, trying to make them move, trying to make them respond to his commands. But there was nothing, no sensation, no movement, just dead weight attached to his body that I'd as well have belonged to someone else. Guards rushed over, surrounding Vincent at the base of the stairs. They could see immediately that something was catastrophically wrong. His legs were bent at unnatural angles, but worse, Vincent wasn't reacting to the obvious fractures with the kind of pain response they expected. The prison doctor arrived, knelt beside Vincent, and began a rapid examine. As his hands moved down Vincent's spine, pressing specific points, checking for reflexes, his face went pale. The doctor had seen enough spinal injuries in his career to recognize the signs immediately. "Spinal cord damage," he said quietly to the guard standing nearby. "Severe damage. He's paralyzed from the waist down." Vincent heard those words and his screaming became even more desperate. More frantic. "Fix it! Fix it!" he shouted at the doctor, his massive hands grabbing at the man's coat. Vincent Callo, who had hospitalized 7 men with his strength, who had served as the muscle for an assassination just days earlier, was now begging, pleading for someone to restore the power his body had lost. The doctor met his eyes with a look of profound sadness and finality. "I can't," he said simply. "The damage is permanent. You'll never walk again." Those words broke something fundamental in Vincent, the man who had relied on his physical power for everything, his livelihood as a boxer, his status in prison, his role in the Italian mob, was now condemned to spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair. His legs, once powerful tools of intimidation and violence, were now useless appendages. No amount of training could fix this. No mob connections could reverse spinal cord damage. Vincent Callo would roll through Sing Sing prison for the remainder of his sentence, a living reminder of what happened when you tried to kill Bumpy Johnson and failed to finish the job. There is a fundamental distinction in the exercise of power that most people fail to grasp, particularly in ENV. Ironments as brutal and unforgiving as prison. Being weak and looking weak are two entirely separate conditions, and understanding the difference between them can mean the difference between life and death, between victory and total defeat. Tony the Blade Marquez, Vincent Callo, and Sal Romano looked at Bumpy Johnson lying in that hospital bed with gray skin, labored breathing, 7 stab wounds, and a punctured lung, and they saw exactly what they wanted to see, a defeated man, a dying king whose reign was over. They confused his physical vulnerability, which was real and undeniable, with total helplessness. This was their fatal miscalculation, the cognitive error that would cost them everything. When Bumpy Johnson was carried into the infirmary on a stretcher, leaving a trail of blood due WN the D-block corridor, he was genuinely close to death. The prison doctor's assessment wasn't pessimistic exaggeration, it was medical reality. 7 stab wounds, 2 to vital organs, a punctured lung, and massive blood loss should have killed him within hours. The fact that he survived the first night was medically remarkable. The fact that he was conscious after 12 hours was nearly impossible. His body was devastated, operating on the very edge of what human physiology could endure. In purely physical terms, Bumpy Johnson was as weak and vulnerable as a human being could be while still drawing breath. But his mind was something else entirely. While Dr. Harrison stitched wounds and stopped bleeding, while nurses monitored his fading vital signs, while the Italian mobsters celebre aided their successful hit with contraband whiskey, Bumpy's consciousness was working through the problem with cold, methodical precision. He couldn't fight, he could barely speak. He certainly couldn't physically retaliate against 3 mob soldiers who had the protection of the Luciano family and corrupted guards. In a traditional confrontation, in any scenario that relied on physical strength or direct action, Bumpy was finished. But Bumpy Johnson hadn't survived in Harlem's criminal underworld, and then navigated the treacherous politics of Sing Sing prison by relying solely on muscle and direct confrontation. He understood that true power in confined environments comes from information, loyalty, access, and the ability to manipulate circumstances through intermediaries. The Italian mobsters ERs made their assessment based on what they could see, a broken body in a hospital bed. They failed to account for what they couldn't see, 18 months of relationship building with the invisible workforce of the prison, a network of loyalty that existed completely outside the traditional power structures they controlled. They failed to understand that Bumpy's greatest asset wasn't his physical stray. It was his intelligence, his strategic thinking, his ability to see the prison as a complex system with multiple pressure points that could be manipulated by someone who understood how all the pieces fit together. While his body was failing, his mind was mapping out exactly how to destroy the men who'd tried to kill him. The performance of weakness was part of Bumpy's weapon. Every time a R&D checked on him and saw that gray skin and labored breathing, every time the doctor shook his head grimly at Bumpy's vital signs, every report that filtered back to Tony, Vincent, and Sal about how Bumpy was barely clinging to life, all of it contributed to their false sense of security. They believed they were safe because they believed Bumpy was finished. They maintained their routines, walked their usual paths, followed their established patterns because they saw no threat from a dying man in a hospital bed. This complacency, this confidence born from mistaking physical weakness for total helplessness, made them vulnerable in ways they couldn't begin to comprehend. When James the porter visited Bumpy's hospital bed at hour 36, the whispered conversation that took place represented the transformation of thought into action. Bumpy couldn't walk down a corridor and confront his attackers. He couldn't physically overpower anyone. He couldn't even raise his voice above a whisper without triggering waves of pain from his punctured lung. But he could communicate. He could give instructions. He could activate the network he'd built over 18 months of treating invisible people with dignity, thank you, and respect. His physical weakness was irrelevant because his actual power, his ability to orchestrate events through others, remained completely intact. The Italian mobsters understood power as something visible and direct. You controlled guards through bribery. You controlled inmates through intimidation. You demonstrated power by putting people in the infirmary or having murders ruled self-death. Hence, their entire framework was built on obvious displays of strength and the visible exercise of force. Bumpy understood that the most dangerous power is the kind that operates invisibly, that moves through channels your enemies don't even know exist, that strikes from angles they can't anticipate because they've trained themselves not to see the people carrying out the actions. A porter spready. NG industrial grease on stairs isn't a threat in the Italian mob's worldview. He's just a porter, invisible, irrelevant. Until suddenly he's the instrument of Vincent Callo's permanent paralysis. This is why the distinction between being weak and looking weak matters so profoundly. Bumpy Johnson lying in that hospital bed with 7 stab wounds was genuinely physically weak. That was not performance. Not deception. But the Italians assumed that physical weakness meant total vulnerability. That a man who couldn't walk or fight was a man who couldn't retaliate. They failed to understand that power in a prison environment doesn't require personal physical strength. It requires intelligence, strategic thinking, established relationships, and the ability to see opportunities where others see only. Routine. Bumpy possessed all of these things, and his physical condition did nothing to diminish them. The Italian mobsters celebrated too early because they won the physical confrontation, and assumed that meant they'd won completely. They never considered that the physical confrontation was only one form of warfare, and not necessarily the most important one in a confined environment where routine, access, and information matter more than muscle. They looked at Bumpy's broken body and saw victory. Bumpy looked at their complacency and saw opportunity. Within 72 hours, that difference in perception would manifest in Vincent Callo screaming at the bottom of a staircase that he couldn't feel his legs, the beginning of a cascade of accidents that would destroy all 3 attackers permanently. The man who looked weakest turned out to be the most dangerous person in Sing Sing prison, precisely because everyone mistook his appearance for his reality. The mathematics of revenge in Sing Sing prison were brutal and absolute. 3 men had attempted to kill Bumpy Johnson, with 7 precisely placed stab wounds on March 11, 1945. 72 hours later, all 3 of those men had been permanently destroyed in ways that made death seem merciful by comparison. Vincent Callo, the 6 feet 3 inches, 240-pound former boxer who had terrorized the prison for 3 years, was now paralyzed from the waist down, confined to a wheelchair for the rest of his natural life. His powerful legs, the foundation of his intimidation and violence, were now useless appendages that he would drag behind him like weight. Sal Romano, according to the promised outcomes, would lose his entire right arm, amputated at the shoulder. transforming him from a reliable operator into a one-armed man struggling to perform even basic tasks in an environment where any sign of weakness invited predation. And Tony the Blade Marquez, the leader, the made man in the Luciano family, the architect of the assassination, AT&T, empty. He suffered the most horrifying fate of all. Brain dead, vegetative state, eyes open but nobody home, a living corpse with just enough brain function to breathe and have a heartbeat, but nothing resembling consciousness, personality, or humanity remaining. What made these outcomes so powerful as a message wasn't just the permanent destruction of 3 lives, it was the complete absence of Evi. Dents connecting any of it to Bumpy Johnson. Vincent's fall down the stairs was ruled an accident, industrial grease that somehow ended up on metal steps, perhaps spilled by a careless worker, perhaps tracked in from the machine shop. These things happen in prisons. Stairs are dangerous. A large man tumbling down 20 steel steps could easily suffer catastrophic spinal damage. No witnesses came forward claiming they'd seen anyone deliberately sabotage the staircase. The investigation, such as it was, concluded that Vincent Callo had been the victim of an unfortunate accident. Sal Romano's loss of his arm would similarly be classified as an accident, some machinery malfunction in the laundry or workshop, some moment of carelessness that resulted in catastrophic injury. And Tony Marquez's descent into a vegetative state. Perhaps he was struck by a falling object. Perhaps he suffered an allergic reaction to something in his food. Perhaps any number of plausible explanations that didn't involve deliberate retaliation from a man who should have been dead. No proof, no witnesses willing to testify. No evidence that could connect these 3 catastrophic accidents to the man lying in the hospital wing recovering from 7 stab wounds. The Italian mob, for all its power and corruption, couldn't prove anything. They couldn't retaliate against Bumpy because they couldn't demonstrate that Bumpy had done anything. The same guards they'd corrupted couldn't find evidence because the evidence didn't exist in any form they recognized. The network of porters, janitors, kitchen workers, and laundry staff who had actually carried out these operations remained invisible, exactly as they always had been. The mob looked for the kind of retaliation they understood: direct violence, confrontation, obvious hits. They never found it because Bumpy's revenge didn't operate on those terms, but the absence of proof didn't matter to anyone inside Sing Sing prison. Every single inmate understood exactly what had happened. 60 men had witnessed the assassination attempt in the D-block corridor. Every prisoner knew that Bumpy had been given hours to live by the prison doctor. And now, within 72 hours of that attack, all 3 attackers had been permanently destroyed, in ways that left them alive to suffer. The message was unmistakable, undeniable, and it echoed through every cell block, every yard, every corner of the prison. You could attack Bumpy Johnson. You could stab him 7 times. You could leave him bleeding on the concrete floor. But if you failed to finish the job completely, if you left him with even a whisper of breath and a functioning mind, the price you would pay was worse than death. This was psychological warfare operating at its highest level. Tony the Blade Marquez, the man who had whispered Luciano sends his regards into Bumpy's ear as he delivered the 7th stab wound, was now wheeled through the prison mess hall every day in his vegetative state. Eyes open, staring at nothing. Drool running down his chin, completely unaware of his surroundings. Inmates woo. LD watched this living corpse being pushed past their tables, and they would remember that just days ago, Tony had been a made man, protected and powerful. They would remember him laughing as he wiped Bumpy's blood off his shiv. And now they watched this shell of a human being, this cautionary tale on wheels. And they understood that challenging Bumpy Johnson was not just dangerous, it was a form of suicide that left you technically alive but destroyed in every way that mattered. Vincent Callo in his wheelchair became another piece of the message. Every time inmates saw this former boxer, this massive, intimidating figure who had put 7 men in the infirmary, now unable to walk, unable to even feel his legs, they understood the price of miscalculation. Sal Romano, with 1 arm, struggling to eat, to dress himself, to perform basic functions in an environment where any weakness made you pray. He was a walking reminder that Bumpy's revenge was thorough, permanent, and inescapable. The genius of the message was its sustainability. These weren't bodies that would be buried and forgotten. These were living testaments to what happened when you tried to kill Bumpy Johnson and failed. Every sigh, Angle Day for years to come, inmates would see these destroyed men moving through the prison. Tony being wheeled to meals in his vegetative state, Vincent struggling in his wheelchair, Sal fumbling with his single arm. The message didn't fade with time. It was refreshed daily, a constant reminder visible to every prisoner that Bumpy Johnson was not someone you could safely attack unless you were absolutely certain you could kill him completely. The Italian mob never attempted another hit on Bumpy Johnson. Not because they forgave him or made peace with him, but because the cost-benefit analysis had changed fundamentally. Yes, they could potentially kill him if they committed enough resources and accepted enough casualties. But the risk of failure was too high, and the consequences of failure were too catastrophic. Better to leave Bumpy alone, to cede territory, to accept losses, than to risk ending up like Tony, Vincent, or Sal. The 7th stab wound that Tony had delivered with such confidence, the one angled toward Bumpy's lung while Tony whispered about Luciano's regards and Harlem being theirs now, that 7th stab wound had failed to finish the job. And that failure, that single miscalculation, had cost 3 men everything. The story spread beyond Sing Sing, carried by released prisoners, by guards, by the vast informal network of communication that exists in the criminal underworld. Bumpy Johnson became legendary not just for surviving 7 stab wounds, but for what he did to the men who had inflicted them. The message was clear, permanent, and terrifying. If you come for the king, you better not miss.